Miami Dolphins made several significant investments in the offensive line for the first time in several years. So we're looking back at past significant investments to see what kind of results we should expect in 2025.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, and NFL staff writer for A to Z Sports. Want to give a special welcome and shout out to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Today on the show, the investment record. If you're on Twitter, it feels like you have your DMs open. You were probably added to about 100 investment groups on private DMs every day with all the Twitter bots. And that's not the kind of investment that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about Bitcoin. Or I'm not talking about any of the other cryptocurrencies. I'm talking about investing resources into players to play at a specific position on the Miami Dolphins. And it's the offensive line. And when you draw a pretty clear line in the sand, I do think there's an interesting divide for what the results have looked like when the Dolphins have chose to invest significantly into players and pour resources into these players that make up the starting five. Everybody knows, and it's been very well established. I'm going to speak some complimentary things about the offensive line, but they're individual pieces of the puzzle. It's not the entire picture. Everybody knows the Dolphins' offensive line has been one of the problem spots for this franchise for wind the clock back however far you'd like for the last 15 years. It's been a sore spot. And I think part of the problem, when you look at, you could draw a line under the Chris Grier era of the pre-Mike McDaniel, and I count the Chris Grier era as 2019 forward. Personally, it's too blurry to be able to identify who was responsible for what level and percentage of decision-making when you're working underneath of an executive, VP of football ops, or whatever. Chris Grier was installed as the unquestioned leader of football operations in 2019. So this exercise looks at 19 to today. And you can draw a line in the first half of this experience and the second half of this experience to date. And I think there's some pretty interesting stories to tell, which is why that's where we're going to invest our time here. Invest, get it? Invest, offensive line investment record, or made several investment jokes on the show, is looking at the pre-Mike McDaniel decision-making process that went into the offensive line, the current Mike McDaniel era decisions, what that means for this year's significant investments in the offensive line. And I think you, over the past two off seasons, have a promising step in the right direction based off of what I think one of the shortcomings has been for the offensive line, which is we have a couple of promising pieces. We have some young developing players. We don't want to create roadblocks for those players getting out on the field and give them a chance to develop. So it creates kind of this false security and complacency that at times has existed where 19 and 20, you draft Austin Jackson and Michael Dieter and Solomon Kinley and Robert Hunt, all in very rapid succession in 2 years. And they're young guys that have to play. And in the midst of that, you sign center Ted Karras to a 1-year, $3 million deal. You sign Eric Flowers to a 3-year, $30 million deal. And the following year comes and goes. And Eric Flowers, you have the regression in the salary cap. So you cut Eric Flowers as a cap casualty. You don't re-sign Ted Karras. And you trade up and go get Liam Eichenberg. Right? And throughout that period of time, it bakes in kind of this want for these players to emerge because you invested in these players, right? It's the self-fulfilling prophecy of, well, we know we need offensive linemen, but we invested in guys, so they're going to have to play and develop and step up. And in some cases it happens, and in some cases it doesn't happen. But I think back to the Brian Flores years, and I said something nice about Brian Flores, or something not nice about Brian Flores, and then I say something nice about Brian Flores, and everybody gets mad when we talk about the Flores era. So please don't get upset. I'm going to talk about Brian Flores, and mainly the offensive side of the ball under Brian, I think, was probably, relationships aside, and what relationships worked and what relationships did not work from a football standpoint with Brian in Miami, not having the answers. And I think part of this just goes back to Brian was born, bred, raised in the Patriot system as far as his NFL coaching experience and connections. And Josh McDaniels is the OC for almost the entirety of the time of the almost 2 decades that Brian Flores spent in New England, right? So that pipeline becomes very narrow for connections to help you. And it was Chad O'Shea, right? It was Chad O'Shea at first, was the first offensive coordinator, and he was dismissed after the year. And he was the Cleveland Browns offensive or wide receivers coach. And then the offensive coordinator search leads to Chan Gailey, tailored to Fitz, but then you draft Tua and that whole weird thing. And we're not getting into any of that. But then Chan Gailey comes and goes, one and done, and you literally can't find anybody else to hire. It becomes co-offensive coordinators with George Godsey and Eric Studesville, but Charlie Fry and where he comes into the fray here is like Tua's Elite 11 coach from wherever with 2 years of play calling experience at any level of football, right? That amount of uncertainty in the direction that you want to go offensively when you're investing in young players makes it hard. Makes it hard to draft and develop talent when the scheme is constantly changing. And you look at the time it took Austin Jackson to get into place. You look at the damage that was done to Liam Eichenberg from playing in different spots with different schemes and different responsibilities, and how much he was yanked around. And a guy like Solomon Kinley that just frankly never really fit anything other than maybe like the 2020 vision for the Dolphins. Michael Dieter, who's going on to become like a nice depth player and utility interior offensive lineman, but he was a center, and then he was guard, and then he was drafted in 19, and he had different offense in 19 and 20 and 21. Like, it's hard. It's hard. So you had this blend of, well, we drafted the young guys, we want them to stick and we want them to play, mixed with, well, the scheme's always changing, and then the way that it's coaching is always changing, and the offensive line coach is changing in purple. What, Brian had 4 in 3 years? The first one did make it through training camp, his first season on the job. It makes development hard, and then you get to the start of the McDaniel era, and they made 2 significant investments in free agency. But then there was still that lingering, well, we invested in these guys, we want to see it. I'm not justifying it, but it's contextualizing why the path has taken the way that it has for the Dolphins. We're going to talk about the Mike McDaniel era of investments next, and then what the history of when Mike McDaniel and Chris Grier decide to commit significant resources to an offensive lineman. What does that success rate look like? And then what does that success rate tell us our expectations should be for names like Jonah Savaiinaea and James Daniels? That's coming your way next here on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. The NFL football season is right around the corner, and when you are looking to stay in on the action, FanDuel has all of the opportunity that you need to make the game that much more exciting for yourself. But you don't have to wait for football season, because summer sports are in full swing, whether you're about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action, so why not make it a little bit more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburnt on the beach. FanDuel has all kinds of matchups, and their app keeps it fresh with daily promotions to always keep the betting fun. I like looking at the NFL win totals. The Dolphins right now, over under 8.5 wins. If you think the Dolphins are going to have a winning season in 2025, you can get over 8.5 wins at plus 160 on the odds. If you feel like the wheels are going to completely fall off the bus this year, you can get the Dolphins under 4.5 wins at plus 480. So whatever end of the spectrum you sit in on, FanDuel has the chance for you to get in on the action for yourself. And if you're new to FanDuel, new customers can get $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. So open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. I hope I'm not tugging on too much scar tissue here, talking offensive line and Brian Flores era and Chris Grier and Mike McDaniel, all in the same show. So my expectations for the comments is that there's going to be some fireworks, even though the 4th of July was last week. But I have down your meaningful investments in the offensive line pre-Mike McDaniel, Chris Grier era. I want to acknowledge who these players are. Austin Jackson, Eric Flowers, Michael Dieter, Robert Hunt, Ted Karras, Liam Eichenberg, Solomon Kinley, Isaiah Prince. And Kinley you traded up for in the 4th round. This is a day 3 pick. Isaiah Prince was a 5th round draft choice. But everybody else, other than Ted Karras, was a 1-year, $3 million deal. It was kind of like a modest bet. But I would say a 1-year, $3 million deal is a fair investment into a player. But Jackson was a 1st round pick. Flowers got 3 for $30 total back in 2020. Dieter was a top 100 pick. Robert Hunt was a top 40 pick. And then Liam Eichenberg, you traded up for in the 2nd round, was a top 50 pick. And you gave up a day 3 pick to trade up and go get him. Some meaningful investments there with not a lot of direction. And as a result, your young players really didn't settle. But you had the promise of young players and you didn't want to spend and blockade those guys. So I get it. So Mike McDaniel comes in and this philosophy changes a little bit. You get Terron Armstead for 5 for $75 total. He plays 3 years of that, 22, 23, and 24, and then retires. And you got Connor Williams for 2 for $14. And both of these guys, when on the field, were very good football players for you. I think that's the first thing that stands out. Terron Armstead, a player of his caliber, does not become available without some red tape. And obviously the knee issue that troubled him since his 2nd or 3rd year in the NFL was something that was a roadblock during his 3 years here. But he ended his career on a high note. There was never a question of the caliber of play that you were going to get when he was out there. And all things considered, $15 million from an annual average salary basis. I mean, there's guys out there making $27, $28 million per year as offensive tackles. So I think the price point relative to the risk and the red tape and what you knew you were going to have to kind of work through, I think made it a fair rate for Terron. And then he, of course, excellent locker room leader, the veteran who helped make the young guys kind of see the game from a different light. Terron Armstead, 5 years, 75 plays, 3 years of it, retires, is willing to play ball with you from a financial standpoint and contract structure standpoint. I have no regrets on that one personally. And when he was out there, he played excellent. Connor Williams, if you remember, signed the 2-year 14, was excellent in 22. We thought, hey, this guy's a quality starter, might become a cornerstone. We did shows on what would you pay Connor Williams on a contract extension. Connor Williams was one of the guys in 23 who played some hardball about getting a contract extension. It's him and Christian Wilkins. And to the Dolphins' credit for all of the Pee Wee League football pushover stuff, they did not cave for Connor Williams 1 year into a $2 billion deal or 2-year deal. And then Connor gets banged up. He gets out in space and pulls the hammy against Denver on the blowout win. and then misses some time, and he tries to come back and aggravates it, and then misses more time, and then has the devastating knee injury against Tennessee in that catastrophic game. Expiring contract, takes forever to land on a deal, signs in Seattle, retires midseason last year. It's a really sucky situation for Connor Williams individually. But at 2 years, $14 million total, I mean, those were the two significant investments the Dolphins made in the first year of the Mike McDaniel, Chris Grier era. And you got two quality starter play out of both of them. And one of them was a guy who you knew had some injury red tape. The other guy was a guy kind of coming off a rookie contract you had high expectations for, but you played out the 2 years, and then he gets hurt and walks. And ironically enough, that was the one big investment in free agency that you put in an offensive line after his contract expires was to his replacement in Aaron Brewer, who we're having the same conversation with. But the Dolphins learned their lesson. They made it a 3-year deal instead of a 2-year deal at the same annual average salary, $21 million, so $7 million per year. The only other significant dollar amount investment that the Dolphins made in 2022 to their offensive line was as they were dealing with the injuries midseason. In early December, they signed Eric Fisher, former top draft choice, never played a snap for the Dolphins. Was put on IR in early January, and that was it. So the McDaniel Grier era in 22, and there was no draft choices here because, again, you drafted Jackson and Hunt and Eichenberg with high draft choices and then signed 2 starters in free agency. And all of their individual developmental curves are obviously at different paces, but at least you had a sustained vision for the offense and what it was going to look like. And now in 25, that's starting to evolve a little bit, and that reflects some of the investments that they made. But I think you got a cornerstone in 22 that regressed into being, air quotes here, just a quality starter in Terron. And then you got a guy who really fit the system perfectly, that played well, and then in 23 had some adverse conditions with some injuries in Connor Williams. He didn't re-up his contract. He walks, and the injury he suffered at the end of 23 was not a career ender, but eventually led to that career ending, which is unfortunate circumstances. 23, I'll be honest, there's not really significant investments in 23. Was Isaiah Wynn 1 year, $2.3 million? Was your marquee investment in the offensive line. I guess technically Dan Feeney was the marquee investment at 1 year, 3.25. And that was kind of your first, hey, it's some Liam Eichenberg competition, right? He's a guy who can play guard, can play center. He was traded in camp for a 6th round pick. I guess they, through their assessment, didn't see enough separation between him and Liam. Of course, 23 was the first year we got a chance to see Liam snap. He became the backup center that year. Ended up starting a lot of games at center for you in 23. But your offensive line investments in 23 was Ryan Hayes was a 7th round draft choice, didn't make the team. Dan Feeney, 1 year, $3.25 million, and Isaiah Wynn, 1 year, $2.3 million, got injured in game 6, and you didn't see him the rest of the year. They just didn't invest. And that's where I think the biggest blockade for some of the restrictions we've seen that further compounds, well, we have young guys, we want to see it through and let them develop, we want to let them play, is the offensive line philosophy that the Dolphins subscribe to with Mike McDaniel as a part of the Kyle Shanahan tree. And the 49ers offensive line coach, Chris Forrester and Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch, they've talked about this philosophy, and the Dolphins have been bought into it. And there's other Shanahan-style offensive schemes across the league that have bought into it as well. And they've all kind of individually evolved at their own rates. The Dolphins are now a part of this club. It's like, well, yeah, it's good in theory. I'm not saying we got to have top-paid players at every position along the offensive line, but we can't just coach our way around it anymore. And I think that's what you saw the Dolphins do this last year, because in 23, he came in and said, well, we'll get Wynn and Feeney as competition for Liam as kind of the guys the question. But at this point, they'd seen some promising flashes from Austin Jackson. He was coming back after not playing in 22. He had the injury. He was played 100 snaps on the season. Robert Hunt had emerged. Connor Williams, they viewed as a hit. Terron Armstead, you viewed as a hit. So you kind of whittled away between the law of averages of you have some hits, you have some misses with your young guys, and then the 2 free agent investments, and you ride that out for 23, the whole offensive line gets walloped, right? And then you have the opportunity, because you're now in year 3 of the system, to kind of start to get ahead of some stuff. You have some pivots with the Connor Williams contract. And so in 2024, they made some next step kind of continuing the vision ideas. And then in 25, there becomes this evolution of what the idea and application is. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the back half of the Mike McDaniel era so far and what those investments look like, including what the 25 investments in James Daniels, Jonah Savaiinaea, and Larry Borom could possibly mean as we round out what the investments that they made before this year have had from a hit rate perspective. That's next. Stick with us here, Locked On Dolphins. Aaron Brewer, 3 years, $21 million, your big investment in 24. They bring back Kendall Lamb on a 1-year, $2.5 million deal. Patrick Paul with a second-round draft choice. And then it's Isaiah Wynn on a reduced rate contract, $1.8 million. You didn't see him till December. And Jack Driscoll at 1 year, $1.79 million. He was cut as part of cutdowns. I would say you probably have 4 significant offensive line investments in the Chris Grier and Mike McDaniel era from 22 to 24. It's Terron Armstead, Connor Williams, Aaron Brewer, Patrick Paul. You have Eric Fisher, that was an in-season signing at a $3 million per year rate for $3 million, but he never played. Dan Feeney, 1 year, 3.25. Modest investment, but not a nothing burger. They flipped him in camp for a 6. Call that an L, call that an L. But I can't sit here and call Terron Armstead, Connor Williams, or Aaron Brewer L's. And we don't know, as Patrick Paul played 300 snaps last year and looked pretty good against Houston before they had to kick him over, and he came in at halftime against Myles Garrett and then had to play right tackle against the Jets. Spoiler alert, not a right tackle. He's a left tackle. Played 4 years at Houston as a left tackle only. He's a left tackle. So I think you have part of the early chapters of this are complicated for better or for worse. In some ways, it's worse. In some ways, you would perceive it to be a good thing. But in some ways, it's worse. Chris Grier shops for the groceries for the recipe that he's given by his coach. When he's shopping for offensive linemen, because the coach says we need offensive linemen, but the coach doesn't really know how the offense is going to look and doesn't have any connections for people that have big-time convictions in what the offense needs to look like, and you burn through offensive line coaches, that shopping, those ingredients are going to sit in the fridge and spoil to some degree, and that's what you saw with some of the Dolphins' investments before Mike McDaniel got here. And then you kind of had, hey, we think this is how we want to do it. We want to have the points of emphasis being your tackles and your center. Your center's your big-time weapon. We have this player that was a hit for us in Robert Hunt from a previous regime playing guard. We made him a contract offer at our price. He didn't sign it. He left and got a $100 million contract somewhere else. Okay, we got guys in the system that know the system. We're going to lean on the system. Didn't work. But when they've invested in centers and tackles with this group, it's looked good. Terron Armstead, healthy, looked good. You knew what the risk was when he came in here. But it was a no-brainer from a talent perspective. And then the 2 centers. And Connor Williams, they converted to play center. And it was a risk. And then the little team that folded for everybody when their cards on the table didn't fold for Connor Williams. And we should be thankful that they didn't, because if they gave him the big contract, the Dolphins would have been stuck with that contract when Connor got hurt. Instead, they pivot to Aaron Brewer, who's not a perfect player. He's not a universal player, but he's a player who does a lot of the things that you want to do. You can get very creative with him. He's not a point A to point B displacement player, but that's what makes the 25 investments important and potentially needle moving. And this is the big difference in the evolution of the scheme. James Daniels is that. He's a displacement player, but he's a good athlete. Jonah Savaiinaea is a displacement player. He's a point A to point B player, but he's also linearly very explosive, and you're going to play him in close quarters as a guard. So if I look at who are significant investments with this brain trust in place and what is their success rate when they choose to commit, and when they choose to not just address, but invest at certain spots and put significant resources into it, Aaron Brewer I'd put down as a W. Connor Williams I'd put down as a W. Terron Armstead I'd put down as a W. Patrick Paul's a TBD. So I think for me, it's been more of, at least with this brain trust, because I think that we've covered the issues that complicate shopping for offensive linemen for a recipe that you don't know what you're baking, and how that impacts your offensive line evaluation ability, and the translation of that and the development of those players into being successful players. I have high expectations for both of these guys. I have high expectations for James Daniels. And obviously the injury thing, it's kind of a Terron Armstead kind of thing. Jonah's a little bit less of a shot in the dark, but he's a rookie. But I mean, they put as much full-chestedness into this investment than any offensive line investment they've made this side of Terron Armstead. Because they were a team that needed draft capital. They gave 98 to move up and go get him. Go up 10 spots and go get this guy. As they're now in year 4 of the regime, and they tried their way, and now you're seeing them target different players for the area that was a part of the, whether you want to call it arrogance or indoctrination or hubris or whatever you want to call it, that like, hey, we can coach around the guards. That they decided they were going to do in 24. Connor Williams is out. Well, we can't work without the center, so let's go get the center. And they hit it. Well, Terron's on his last legs. Let's get the tackle. We'll see what that looks like. So all things considered, I think it's been the resistance to put guys you invested in on the bench and not let them work through and try to develop. And then the scheme, the flaws in the scheme ideology, I think have been the biggest blockades for us seeing this group come to life in a way that we want it to. 23 was the year it was all going to line up. 23 was the year because you had Rob Hunt on his rookie deal. You had Connor Williams in year 2 with a proof of concept as a quality starter. You got Austin Jackson healthy that year, and he showed himself to be a scheme fit for what you were trying to do. You had Terron Armstead, and your 4th spot was, well, between Rob Jones, Isaiah Wynn, and Liam Eichenberg. You can work around one spot. And generally speaking, you can work around one spot. But when the backups play more snaps than the starters in 4 out of the 5 spots on the offensive line that year, what are you going to do? Right? So I look at when they've chosen to commit and invest, at least this group, they have a pretty decent record of successes. I expect the same. And if we don't get it, you could put that in the ledger at the end of the year when we tally everything up and we decide what direction we need to go as an organization. That's going to do it for us here today on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Appreciate you guys as always for checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your Wednesday. I'll be back again tomorrow. More Miami Dolphins talk coming your way. Hope to see you then. Go Fins.